Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. So, 3 years and a month ago, I had our guest Marcus Kolga on my show, and he was one of the first people that I spoke with that said, "You know what? Putin needs to be listened to. His threats of invading Ukraine might actually be true." And most of the people in the media, most people I was talking to, said, "Oh no, it's just bluster. It's just bluster. He's trolling us. That's it. He's not actually going to do it." And Marcus said, "You know what? They're massing on the borders, and I think it's going to happen." And a week or two or three later, Russia invaded Ukraine. So Marcus, 3 years hence, welcome back. Thank you very much for coming back. Thank you for your comments several years ago. People are saying that Trump is trolling us. That this is the right thing to do. There's no way out. We need peace, peace in our time, etc. What's your assessment? What's going on? What should we do? Is this Munich all over again? Let me
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. Well, listen, thanks for having me on, Brian, and thanks for mentioning the fact that I was one of the few Canadians who was raising alarms about what was happening on Russia's western border. The troops that were already amassing those troops there in August of 2021, and so we could see sort of the buildup there. The military infrastructure that was being built up, and so by December of 2021, it was pretty clear what he was going to do. But again, you mentioned the fact that a lot of Western experts, a lot of Western governments, including our own, just didn't want to believe that Vladimir Putin would so completely and aggressively overturn the post World War II, post Cold War order that we've all sort of been benefiting from. And even back then, I think it was in early December of 2021, I warned about making any concessions to Vladimir Putin, because you'll recall that he was trying to squeeze the Western world. He was threatening very clearly to invade Ukraine unless we provided him with some sort of assurances to keep Ukraine out of the European Union, to keep Ukraine out of NATO, and to guarantee that those territories that he already invaded and annexed in 2014, that he would be able to keep those, and that we would recognize Russia's annexation of those territories. And I said already back in December 2021 that if we do concede any of this to Vladimir Putin, that he will only take more. We have seen this. It's been an ongoing pattern for the past 25 years that he has been in power. And I should remind your listeners that there haven't been free and fair elections in Russia in 25 years. And so we've seen this pattern of aggression. And Vladimir Putin has warned us over and over again. He has made his intentions very clear, and he's carried them through. And so we should also be very wary about this new alliance that is forming between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. When Donald Trump says the same sorts of things about Canada being the 51st state, about annexing our territory, we should take those threats very, very seriously, because we've seen how his allies, his new allies, his friends carry through on those threats as well.
So you were one of the people, and I can't remember whether it was 3 years ago or in one of the other interviews, that you said when I was comparing what was going on in Ukraine to Munich and some of the people that wanted to make peace at the time, you said, "Well, Brian, no, this started with Crimea." And if you're going to look at a historical analogy, you got to look back to, I think it was 2014 and the takeover of Crimea, and said that was Austria. Yeah. And this now is Czechoslovakia. And so my question to you now is are there historical parallels? Does appeasement work? And my memory, you're the expert. My memory is that lots of people, most people within the Conservative Party in the UK, thought that actually Chamberlain was brilliant for a while until he wasn't. And there was only a lone voice, Winston Churchill, that was the one person that was against what Chamberlain had done for maybe a year and a half until 1939, September 1st, and the invasion. And so does this just repeat itself? And are we worried about the Baltics and the next move a couple of years from now?
I mean, this is a really big question. on the point of Churchill, I mean, we desperately need a Churchill at this moment. There may be one that does begin to appear in Europe. Emmanuel Macron has taken some pretty solid positions on all of this, realistic positions, recognizing the fact that we've certainly lost the United States as a transatlantic ally for the next 4 years, maybe even for another generation, depending on what happens after the next U.S. presidential election. And so we need someone. But presuming that's a good point. I mean, who knows? I suspect that this current administration will find all sorts of ways to try and remain in power. They're clearly taking a page out of the authoritarian playbook, the one that Vladimir Putin has written, others as well, Viktor Orban, his counterpart in Hungary, and so who knows what will happen? But we at this moment we need that Churchill, because clearly we can no longer depend on the United States as a global force for good to defend the democratic order. That time is now over. We are in a completely new era. We are in uncharted territory here. And so, going back to the initial part of your question about this, where we're at, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, this conflict that we see really started in 2014, but it goes even further back than that. I mean, we saw signs of this already in 2000 when Vladimir Putin came to power. I mean, there are claims and very credible claims that he was bombing apartment buildings in Moscow through the FSB, that's the Russian Secret Services, to justify his war against, or his aggression towards Chechnya. This is an oblast, a territory in the south of Russia that was seeking its independence, and he was using that to basically bolster his own popularity ahead of Russian presidential elections in 2000. And that just continued. There's a violent crackdown on free expression in Russia that started almost immediately, the shutting down of independent media. And in 2007, we saw Russia's first ever state-sponsored cyber attacks against Estonia, where Moscow tried to destabilize Estonia's own democracy in order to provoke some sort of a change in government there, a coup, if you will. And then we saw, of course, 2 years later, the Russian invasion of Georgia, and then in 2014. And each time we've seen these warning signs, we've failed to stand up to Vladimir Putin. And that failure to stand up against his foreign aggression, even his repression at home, has simply enabled more and more of that behavior. And so now, we're in this position. You mentioned Munich as a historical analogy. I suspect that right now we are in a situation that is not like 1938, but more like 1939, in August of 1939, when Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler came together to sign an agreement, a secret agreement, to carve up most of Europe between them and to coordinate the start of World War II. I think that this phase that we are in currently is more analogous to that situation in 1939.
Oh my God, you're saying Donald Trump is Joseph Stalin?
I'm saying that Vladimir Putin, the way that they have come together here, Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, they have come together pushing out Ukraine to decide the future of Ukraine between them. Now, Ukraine will likely reject this, but it's not just Ukraine. Whatever they decide on, those two, the Americans and the Russians right now, and Trump, that will impact Europe's future security. It will impact our future security arrangements as Canadians. So we have two large powers here basically deciding the future of the Western Alliance and Europe. So in that sense, I find that if we want a comparison, August of 1939 is a much closer comparison to what's happening right now.
Well, I've heard people say that Yalta and the carving up of the world between two major superpowers at Yalta is a comparison. This is the first time I've heard anyone suggest that this is similar to the pact between Stalin and Hitler. That said, when someone's demanding half of your critical minerals, it may not be military action to take over your country, but it's effectively a demand to take over a lot of the resources of your country, which is kind of scary that you've used that analogy.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is it's extortion on an international level. It is basically what I would term mafia diplomacy that the U.S. is currently engaged in, and so I don't think it's that much different from some of those regimes that we talked about. And again, looking at those threats to Canada's sovereignty, this nonsense about a 51st state. I mean, we have to take those threats seriously, given the alignment that we're seeing between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. The fact that Donald Trump is now echoing Russia's justifications for this invasion, suggesting that somehow Ukraine was responsible for starting this war, which is complete and utter nonsense. If he's repeating that sort of disinformation, those sorts of very obvious lies, there's no reason to believe that he won't start using similar strange justifications in terms of the coming trade war between the United States and Canada, and perhaps even worse. Those threats of annexation of Canada should be taken very seriously because we should take Donald Trump, quite frankly, at his word at this point.
Extortion, mafia, negotiations. Really?
Yeah. I mean, this is what we're seeing. If you're demanding $500 billion just for Ukraine to hand over $500 billion worth of its natural resources, this is extortion. We're seeing it over and over again. These contracts that have been placed before President Zelensky, canceling high-level meetings unless he signs this contract. He has no mandate to do that, and he said that very, very clearly. He cannot sell Ukraine to, and he doesn't even know who he's selling it to. Is he selling it to the U.S. government, Donald Trump, or is it one of the oligarchs that is supporting him? Where are these natural resources going? So repeatedly, we're hearing these every day. There's a new demand for these rare earth minerals that Ukraine has, and I don't think there's any other way of characterizing it other than extortion.
We're going to take a break. We need to take a break for some rest after that and some messages, and we'll be back with Marcus Kolga, expert with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute on Eastern Europe, national security issues, and disinformation. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Marcus Kolga is my guest tonight. He's an expert with Macdonald-Laurier Institute on Eastern Europe, on defense issues, and on disinformation. And that's, I think, one of the areas of expertise that you really had before this whole war started. And I want to go back to that, if I could, for a second, Marcus. And it seems to me like Donald Trump and numerous different members of his new administration are living in a different information world than I thought we were living in. And this thing that Zelensky is at 4% in the popularity, that he hasn't been democratically elected, that he's got no support, that Ukraine started the war. Where is this coming from?
I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, first of all, Donald Trump has truly surrounded himself with some very strange picks in terms of his cabinet. Basically the chief of intelligence that he has picked, Tulsi Gabbard, is a notorious supporter of foreign authoritarian regimes. In Syria, she basically aligned herself with the Assad government, rejecting any claims of mass human rights abuses, the poisoning of Syrians, the chemical attacks on his own people. She basically rejected all of these. She has also clearly and regularly aligned herself with Vladimir Putin and much of the disinformation that he has been advancing about Ukraine. And so, and you can look down sort of the list of cabinet picks, and it's a really motley crew of individuals who have held very curious beliefs, conspiracy theory, and advanced conspiracy theories on a whole range of issues. And so it's not really that surprising to see this rather abrupt turn within the Trump administration and Donald Trump himself, whereby, as you say, I mean, it seems like they are now living in some sort of alternate reality, and it's in an alternate reality that I'm quite familiar with, as you mentioned. I work very closely and have been monitoring the Russian information space, their disinformation attacks on the Western world for the past 15 years. And what I'm hearing from Donald Trump very much, it would make me believe that he has fallen for much of that Russian disinformation that's being advanced, especially about Ukraine since 2014, but of course more aggressively over the past 3 years. So, much of that coming from the Kremlin has been focused on trying to discredit Ukraine's government, President Zelensky himself. Some of the familiar narratives, and I'm sure some of your listeners have heard them as well, that Russia was engaging in a 3-day special operation, not a war, not an invasion, but a special operation to denazify the Ukrainian government. President Zelensky is, of course, himself Jewish. That's very well known. And so, this is one of the narratives that's being pushed out there. One of the other narratives is that the Ukrainian government is somehow illegitimate, that it came to power via a coup, and that President Zelensky, having imposed martial law, which is a perfectly normal thing to do when you are under constant bombardment by a foreign power, when your civilian infrastructure is being targeted, and the foreign adversaries are trying to take over a chunk of your country, imposing martial law is perfectly normal. And under those conditions, having elections is next to impossible. So suggesting that he is a dictator or somehow is engaging in a war to prolong the martial law and to push back elections as far as possible is another form of disinformation that is trying to discredit President Zelensky. And there are countless others, these silly narratives about Western weapons that are supplied to Ukraine, that they're being sold off somehow on the black market. All of these have been introduced by the Kremlin into the Western and global information space to try and discredit the Ukrainian government. And ultimately, the point is to erode Western support for Ukraine so that Russia has a greater ability to dominate and win this war. And so all of these narratives are very well known, and it's actually quite shocking to see Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump rather, repeating these, these falsehoods, this disinformation intended to discredit Ukraine. And the bigger problem with all of this is that when you have the President of the United States repeating these falsehoods, it lends a certain degree of legitimacy to them, unfortunately. And so taken all of this, what we've seen over the past 4 weeks, what we're hearing now, especially over the past 2 weeks, this represents a major, major victory for Russian information operations. It's historic. I don't think they've ever had such a big win in terms of those sorts of operations ever. So this is a very big moment for Vladimir Putin, but also a deeply concerning one for all Western democracies, Canada included.
I just came back from an extended business trip in the southern United States, talking to some really nice people that I do business with and I interacted with.
Yep.
That believe all this, and over drinks voiced back to me a lot of the same stories. Is it working?
Yeah, it's working. This Russia has been spending on average about $1.5 billion a year on these sorts of information influence operations. We just saw in September of last year a U.S. Department of Justice indictment exposed a scheme whereby Russia Today, this is Russian state media outlet RT, which has been identified by Global Affairs and the U.S. State Department as a critical arm of Russia's intelligence operations. RT spent $10 million to develop a new media platform in North America, allegedly led by 2 Canadians living just outside of Montreal and employing an army of far-right influencers, including a Canadian, who were then paid up to $100,000 per podcast episode. Can you imagine getting paid that much for one of these episodes? To basically promote Kremlin-aligned narratives about Ukraine, about issues targeting Canadians, Americans, North Americans in general. And these videos, these podcasts, were consumed by tens of millions of Canadians and Americans. And they are clearly very much having an impact. The fact that, again, we have the President of the United States parroting Russian disinformation narratives is a clear indication that it's working, because the ultimate objective of those narratives is to impact both public opinion, but also democratic decision making. So, we saw how this impacted, for example, the delay of U.S. support for Ukraine last year. There was a congresswoman out of Georgia, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who was regularly parroting these Russian disinformation narratives, and all of that caused that very critical support for Ukraine to be delayed by the United States. So it was working then. That delay cost Ukrainian lives. It cost them on the front lines as well. Now that we're seeing the President of the United States repeat them, it's going to clearly have an impact on these negotiations. I mean, you can't even call them negotiations at this point. But it will have an impact on what is happening right now and what will happen on the front lines down the road. And the fact that your anecdote about business colleagues in the southern United States repeating them, I mean, that I think speaks to the prevalence of these narratives, the spread of them, and the fact that they have really taken hold in a significant portion of the U.S. electorate, and that's a huge problem. It's a growing problem, I believe, here in Canada as well. It's one that we have completely ignored. In fact, I would say that the Hogue Commission that was set up to investigate these, they truly failed to acknowledge the extent of Russian information operations targeting this country. And that report itself, there are multiple failures in it, but it really set us back in terms of defending our democracy against Russia's efforts to destabilize and undermine our democracy.
Marcus, given this situation and what you've described, how do you know what the truth is? How do you combat this disinformation?
Well, I mean, there are several ways of doing that. I think for the average Canadian, I mean, you have to be really careful about where you consume your news and information media from, ensuring that you're consuming that information from trusted sources. This could be newspapers, television media, making sure that when you are looking for information, that you're getting that information from professional journalists. These are individuals who are trained to handle facts properly and to communicate those facts to a broader audience. Making sure that we understand the difference between facts and opinion. I think if you look to the United States and platforms like Fox News, that line often gets blurred. And so making sure that we know, again, where we're consuming information from, who we're consuming it from, that's important. I would try to avoid social media as much as possible. I think we've all had concerns about the kind of information that is being published to social media. It provides a platform for, whether it's foreign actors or even just petty hucksters who are trying to profit from amplifying rage, tapping into the emotions and biases of users. It's not a great place to basically consume information from. And if you're over reliant on social media, I would try to reduce that reliance. And the fact that social media has removed, whether it's Twitter, X as it were, Facebook, that they have these platforms have removed all moderation essentially from those platforms, it really has become the Wild West. And it is, in terms of information, it is a extraordinarily toxic space. So limit your time on social media. Get a subscription to a newspaper, whether it's the Globe or the Star or the Post, or even the Toronto or the Sun newspapers. Any one of those, they have professional journalists. That's probably the best way that the average Canadian can ensure that they're getting good information.
We're going to take a break for some messages. When we come back, I want to turn back to what's going on in Ukraine, what could or should happen in Ukraine, and then the implications on Canada with Marcus Kolga, our expert on Eastern Europe, geopolitical issues, national defense, and disinformation. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. My guest tonight is Marcus Kolga, who is with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He is an expert on Eastern European issues. He's been someone that I've had the pleasure and honor of interviewing a few times. He was one of the first people that I spoke with that really said we had to take Vladimir Putin's threats 3+ years ago seriously, and that Marcus, you actually said that he intends to attack. A couple minutes ago, you said we need to take Donald Trump more seriously. What do you mean by that?
Well, look, we need to take both Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin seriously. The post Cold War peace that we have enjoyed for the past 30 odd years is clearly coming to an end. We are facing more threats to generally to our sovereignty than we have in a generation, perhaps ever at this point. I warned about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I've also been warning about Russia's militarization of the Arctic over that same period. We have to recognize that Vladimir Putin has either refurbished or built new military bases in the Arctic with offensive capabilities over the past 20 years. These are long-range bomber bases, missile bases. He's also built super weapons, Arctic super weapons, high-speed stealth underwater nuclear torpedoes that are intended to run underneath the Arctic ice and eradicate coastlines in North America, whether it's in the United States or Canada. Russia's also claimed all of the resources underneath the Arctic Sea. They did this about 3 years ago. There's a submission into the UN. That would bring Russia's claim right up to our 200-mile economic exclusive zone in the Arctic. And Russia's also published a document, this is 2 years ago, on its Arctic foreign policy, warning that Russia is preparing for a coming conflict in the Arctic. Now, where would that conflict potentially be sparked? I don't think it's Canada. We don't have imperial ambitions anywhere, never mind the Arctic. And so we need to take those warnings very seriously. At the same time, we know that Donald Trump has clearly, as I mentioned earlier, it seems to be a growing alignment between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. Donald Trump looks to Vladimir Putin as a strong man who he very much admires. I think he has ambitions to become sort of a North American version of Vladimir Putin. And so what we've seen, what we've heard since the end of November, just after the U.S. presidential elections, are these threats to potentially annex Canada. What were initially sort of dismissed as jokes about the 51st state, I think need to be taken very seriously. If you combine them with everything else that Donald Trump has been saying, this demand to have to take $500 billion worth of Ukraine's rare earth minerals. Canada also has rare earth minerals that we know Donald Trump covets. Or maybe it's not Donald Trump, but maybe it's Elon Musk who covets them. We have all sorts of other resources that Donald Trump covets. And so when he continuously makes talks about the 51st state, talks about annexation, threatens us with various forms of economic warfare, I think that the signs are very clear, and we need to take this very seriously. What our government needs to do is to prepare to defend our sovereignty and Canadians from these all these threats and forms, or rather these threats to our sovereignty and potential forms of aggression, whether it's in the Arctic with the Russians. Also, China is very active there, but also with the United States. That means looking to some of our allies, possibly seeing what they're doing to prepare their own people for potential aggression. The Swedes have been doing this for quite some time, over the past 4 years, in fact. They've even published on I think twice now over the past 4 years, pamphlets that are sent to every single Swedish household that basically inform Swedes of how to prepare for a conflict, potentially for war, how to defend themselves against foreign information operations, psychological warfare, how to defend themselves against cyber attacks and these sorts of things. This is something that I think Canada needs to start thinking about. And we also need to start looking to our own defense, making sure that we give our armed forces the resources they need to defend our sovereignty. Right now, we've been failing to do that for several decades now, and our military is in a bit of a tough spot. So doing that rapidly, this is something that we need to do, and it's not something that we can afford to sort of discuss or think over the next years, not even months. I mean, this is something that we need to do immediately, and we need to start talking to our allies. There seem to be cracks appearing in NATO. If that's the case, we need to start talking to those allies to figure out alternate arrangements for our collective defense. That could be, speaking with the United Kingdom, who has established the Joint Expeditionary Force, JEF, with our Nordic allies, maybe working with them as an alternate to NATO. But we can't wait for this. We need to start doing this right now, because the threat is imminent. It's right before us, whether it's Vladimir Putin or Donald Trump, and that's not going away. This is only going to become a bigger problem the further we wait. And again, we're only 4 weeks into this. We've got another 4 years to go.
Donald Trump seems to admire President McKinley, and my understanding is that he had intentions to annex Western Canada.
Right, and so I think this is, I've heard some Canadian pundits dismiss this as, maybe it's or just to believe that this is about the border, whether it's about fentanyl, it's about trade. It's not. This is about Donald Trump's own vanity. He is thinking about his legacy, and there's not much that you can do to negotiate with someone who is thinking about Canada, maybe other territories, and the expansion of the United States. If that is the root of those ambitions, and so this is something that we need to acknowledge, we need to accept in terms of our own preparations to potentially defend against those potential efforts to take over or annex parts or all of Canada. I
had a drink with someone who, maybe just in jest, but just take it for what it is, just in jest, maybe said that the Gulf of America was step one, that Panama and Greenland, manifest destiny, will be step two, and Canada will be step three. And if we don't stop them at the Gulf of America, step two is going to happen, and then we for sure have to stop. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I don't think it's unreasonable. I mean, he was deadly serious about Gulf of America. I mean, I think most Canadians were laughing at it. It's just so absurd, frankly stupid. But he is extremely serious about just the Gulf of America. Let's not forget that I think it was a week or week and a half ago that there was an AP reporter in the White House pool who referred to the Gulf as the Gulf of Mexico. And because the AP reporter didn't adopt this new Trump speak, the AP was thrown out of the White House press pool, or temporarily banned until they accepted Trump's new new name for the Gulf of Mexico. So, I mean, I think that demonstrates the seriousness with which Donald Trump views all of this. I don't think that those threats against Greenland should be ignored. I think Denmark has clearly, seen the warning signs and is taking it very seriously. In fact, the Danish government last week said that it was doubling its defense spending in response to those threats. I mean, obviously, there's a threat from Vladimir Putin as well in the Arctic, but with those threats against Greenland, it's taking measures and is doing it immediately. We're still sort of hemming and hawing about this, and we can't afford to do that. Our allies are taking this threat seriously, Donald Trump's threats seriously. Canada needs to be taking Donald Trump's threats seriously as well.
So if you were sitting down with the prime minister or the next prime minister, what would you tell him?
Well, there are a few things. I mean, again, increased defense spending immediately in order to deter the sort of threats that we're seeing and to prevent anyone from even considering violating our sovereignty. We should be speaking with our allies immediately about how we can collectively defend, whether it's the Baltic states, whether it's Greenland, whether it's our own sovereignty. Working together to do that, that's key. Diversifying our trade, working more closely with our European and like-minded democratic allies, whether it's in the Indo-Pacific or otherwise, diversifying that trade so that we're not over-reliant on the United States, and making sure that the energy, the resources that we have, that they can be brought to market. I was talking to officials in Europe, in Lithuania and Estonia. Already, this was, before the current war, just before COVID. We'd seen what happened in 2014 in Crimea. All of them were they were begging for Canadian liquefied natural gas as a way to wean off their over-reliance on Russia. So there is a market waiting for a global market waiting for our resources. We should be, building pipelines to the east. And it seems that whether it's the Liberal leadership candidates for the federal party, Pierre Poilievre, others, I think everyone is sort of recognizing this, and I suspect that we'll see action on that. But these are just a few things that we need to be doing, and we also need to be preparing, as I mentioned earlier, our own citizens for potential conflict. I think that we have, as Canadians, have been so complacent. Whether it's after the Second World War, certainly after the end of the Cold War, we've become completely complacent in terms of our own security, and so I think we need to have that wake-up call. I mentioned what the Swedes were doing. We need to do a similar thing. The government needs to be honest with its citizens to let them know that we're in for a very rough ride over the next few years, and give them points about how they can prepare themselves to weather this storm. And by doing that, I think that we can build a much more resilient society and democracy in face of those potential attacks on our information spaces and as well as our sovereignty.
President McKinley, I understand, took over Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and some other territories, and just did it with economic coercions and annexation. If Trump annexes Greenland, what should we do?
Well, I don't think we should wait. Are we okay with waiting for Donald Trump to annex Greenland or to exert American power in Panama or elsewhere? I don't think we can afford to wait. I think we have to assume that he will target Greenland. I mean, right now, Ukraine is the shiny object that he's focused on, but that'll change. I mean, you never know. I mean, it seems like when he wakes up in the morning, he gets a thought into his head. That's the next thing that he moves on to. He'll come back to Greenland. And so I think we just have to assume that he is going to spend much of his focus over the next 4 years trying to trying to annex Greenland. But we should also assume that he will do the same with Canada. So again, as I said before, we need to be working with our allies. We should be talking to the Danes. The Danes are essentially, they are our neighbors in the Arctic, working with the Danes to come up with a common strategy, and furthermore with our Nordic partners, the United Kingdom, others, a common strategy to ensure that if the United States decides to engage in whether it's economic warfare or even, I dare say, physical warfare to try and annex parts or all of Canada or Greenland, that we are prepared to defend against it. And if we work right now, we can hopefully create a credible deterrence to prevent that from ever happening.
It looks like in the next, I don't know, weeks, days, months, something's going to be negotiated in Ukraine. And I don't know whether you're right that it's comparable to Stalin and Hitler getting together to carve up Poland, or whether it's Yalta and FDR and Stalin and Churchill getting together to carve up the world, or whether it's Afghanistan and agreeing to just sort of leave Afghanistan. I don't know what the right analogy is, or if there is any analogy, but what role can Canada and the rest of Europe play to influence this negotiation that seems to be taking place right now without Ukraine at the table?
But why are we calling it a negotiation? I mean, it's a negotiation between the United States and Russia about the future of a territory that, America has no business negotiating about. I mean, Donald Trump can agree to some sort of terms with Vladimir Putin. In fact, he's already given away everything that Vladimir Putin has asked for. But that doesn't mean that Ukraine needs to accept that. It doesn't mean that the Western democratic allies, which Canada is part of, it doesn't mean that we have to agree to that. If we decide that collectively, in consultations with Ukraine, if we agree that this is something that is completely unacceptable and that we need to, support Ukraine in continuing its fight to reestablish the sovereignty of those territories that Russia has annexed, to give it a strong position from which to negotiate from once Ukraine is prepared for those negotiations. That's something that we can do. And I think that we're seeing European nations wake up to this reality that that they are going to have to increase that support for Ukraine. No one is interested in capitulation. Everyone, I think most European nations, recognize that any concessions to Vladimir Putin will only help enable future aggression, and that future aggression might turn towards established NATO members and other European countries. And so I think most European nations recognize that we need to do all that we can right now to give Ukraine those tools to negotiate from a position of strength and to push back against Vladimir Putin. Because ultimately, look, Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, they are basically schoolyard bullies. They go around, they threaten everyone in the schoolyard, taking their lunch money. What stops schoolyard bullies is when someone stands up and gives them a bloody nose. That's what's needed right now. We need to push back on Putin, make sure that Ukraine can take back some of, and we can do that. We can do that if we supply Ukraine with the weapons that it needs. It's already proven that it can do that. If we continue supporting it, then I think that there's a real chance for Ukraine to claim a victory in this war. But that's the only way forward. Because if we now step back, if we allow Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin to make these decisions about Ukraine without Ukraine at the table, without European voices or Canada's voice at the table, then that opens us up to a significant future aggression, whether it's from Putin or from the United States.
I guess my problem with what you're saying is that I think that, yes, you're right, that you need someone that's going to step up and give the bully a bloody nose, but you need the rest of the crowd, the rest of the people to support. And, I'll use the example of your AP reporter If every other reporter in that pool had also called it the Gulf of Mexico, maybe there would have been a change, but not one other reporter was willing to support the AP reporter and call it openly the Gulf of America.
Yeah.
Sorry, the Gulf of Mexico, Freudian slip. And so we seem to be willing to go with the flow to allow the bullies to extort what they want. I'm going to come back after a break and ask you one last question, because I think this, to me at least, is the most important question that I've got at this time, and you're the person that could possibly answer it. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes with a concluding question to Marcus Kolga, our expert on what's going on, what the heck is going on in Eastern Europe and the world today. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're just having, I think, a wonderful conversation with Marcus Kolga from the Macdonald Laurier Institute, an expert on Eastern Europe and what's going on there. Marcus, I got to ask you a question. We talked about analogies, and I think the analogy that is best here is the Munich conference and appeasement and peace in our time and stuff like that. And I guess I think that most people in America and in the UK actually supported Chamberlain for a long time. For a year and a bit. And there was one lone voice that was disagreeing and was actually in the same party as Chamberlain, and that was Winston Churchill. And so when everything changed on September the 1st, 1939, and Churchill was proven right when Hitler attacked Poland, the king very quickly called up Churchill and asked him to form a government because he was the logical person. And he, I think, was critical in saving Britain, if not the Western world. So I ask you, sir, if you accept that analogy, we need a Chamberlain. Sorry, again, Freudian slip. We don't need a Chamberlain. We need a Churchill today. Who is Winston Churchill today? Who could be?
We've had enough Chamberlains over the past 10 years. Look, I think. I don't agree. I don't think that the Munich analogy is apt anymore. I mean, our Munich already passed a long time ago. I would argue that Barack Obama, despite being a dignified, strong leader for the American people, foreign policy-wise, I mean, this retreat that we've been seeing really started with President Obama. The red lines that he drew in terms of Syria and Ukraine as well. I mean, these have been crossed repeatedly. His efforts to reset relations with Vladimir Putin. I don't know if you recall, Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, standing with Sergei Lavrov with that silly big red reset button. They were unable to read Vladimir Putin. They were unable to forecast the direction that the world is taken, especially with these authoritarians, and they were more than happy to appease them. So it's a trajectory that we've sort of been on already for, I'd say, over a decade. The rise of Donald Trump is a really disturbing sort of ultimate manifestation of all of what's been happening during that time. Yeah, we need a Churchill right now. But looking at least in the United States, you're right. I mean, everyone is just sort of, I think that those that could have potentially stood up to be that Churchill, I mean, they're all defeated. They've all sort of gone silent. What we need today, I would argue, is a John McCain. We need someone like John McCain to step up and push back, but there's no one like that. I think in Canada, it's difficult. I mean, surveying the potential leaders for the Liberal Party, in the opposition, I don't see someone who I would identify as being a Churchill there. In Europe, we do have potential figures like that. I mentioned President Macron, but President Macron has consistently stood up and spoken against Vladimir Putin and his ambitions in Ukraine. I think within the European Union, we have a very strong European, basically a foreign minister, the person in charge of Europe's external relations, Kaja Kallas, Estonia's former prime minister. She is extraordinarily strong, and I would say, a bit like a Churchill, maybe even a bit like a Thatcher in terms of foreign policy. She's very strong, and her voice should be elevated because I think she could be a strong leader. But ultimately, there aren't too many people because I think everyone, especially over the past 4 weeks, everyone's heads are spinning, and I think everyone is trying to assess where we're at, where we might be going. But like I said, there are a few of those European leaders that we can look to, and I do hope that in Canada, a leader will emerge. Someone who would be like Brian Mulroney. Brian Mulroney was exceptional, and I don't know why we don't look to him as a role model when it comes to our international leadership. Under his leadership, we were able to lead the fight against apartheid in South Africa, and we were also leaders within the G7, thanks to Brian Mulroney in August of 1991. In bringing down the Soviet Union. This is a part of that history that's very often overlooked. I mean, there's this assumption that it was the United States and other allies that did that. It was Canada who eventually really was critically important in pulling the plug on Soviet repression and occupation of much of Eastern Europe. So, looking to Mulroney, maybe there's someone who, if they might be inspired by him, might rise in Canada, but we do need someone like that, a Churchill figure at this point, but I don't see an obvious one, at least not here in North America.
Looking for Winston Churchill. Marcus Kolga, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. We've got a really important week coming up. We've got leadership debates within the federal Liberal Party. We got a provincial election in Ontario, and we've got the next edition of what's going on in Ukraine, if not what's going on in the United States. So lots of stuff going on. Marcus, pretty appreciate it. Thank you.
Anytime. Thanks for having me on, Brian.